The North Carolina morning hung thick with humidity as Jake Morrison adjusted his worn baseball cap and hefted his toolbox from the back of his pickup truck. Fort Bragg buzzed with its usual pre-dawn activity. Soldiers jogging in formation, the distant sound of helicopters warming up, and the rhythmic cadence of drill instructors barking commands. Jake had grown accustomed to this symphony over the past 3 years, though it still sent an occasional chill down his spine. At 45, Jake moved with the deliberate efficiency of someone who'd learned that wasted motion could cost lives. His civilian contractor uniform, navy work shirt and khaki pants, marked him as an outsider among the soldiers, which suited him perfectly. The less attention he drew, the better. "Morning, Mr. Morrison," called out Specialist Rodriguez as Jake approached the communications building. The young soldier was barely 22, his uniform crisp enough to cut glass. "Jake's fine," Morrison replied, as he had every morning for months. He didn't need the formality, didn't want it. Those days were behind him. Inside the building, the familiar hum of radio equipment greeted him. Banks of communication gear lined the walls, some cutting-edge digital systems, others older analog units that Jake knew better than his own heartbeat. This was his domain now, a world of circuits and frequencies where the only voices that mattered came through speakers, not face-to-face. Jake pulled out his work order for the day, routine maintenance on the training frequency modulators, simple work that would keep him busy and anonymous. He preferred assignments that didn't require interaction with active duty personnel, especially officers. Too many questions, too much curiosity about his background. As he opened his toolbox and began disassembling the first unit, Jake's mind wandered to the news he'd caught on the radio during his drive to base. Another veteran suicide in Fayetteville. The third this month. Jake gripped his screwdriver tighter and forced himself to focus on the task at hand. The past was a luxury he couldn't afford, especially not here, surrounded by reminders of what he'd left behind. The morning passed quietly until around 10:30, when the building's main door burst open. Lieutenant Sarah Chen strode in, her expression tight with frustration. At 26, she carried herself with the confident bearing expected of an officer, but Jake noticed the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her jaw was set a fraction too firm. "Is the contractor here?" she asked Specialist Rodriguez, not bothering to look in Jake's direction. "That's me," Jake said, not looking up from his work. "Problem with your comms?" Lieutenant Chen approached his workstation, her boots clicking sharply on the linoleum floor. "We've got a field exercise starting at 1400. 3rd Platoon, Bravo Company. The primary communication array went down during pre-checks and I need it operational in 3 hours. Jake finally looked up, taking in the young officer's determined expression. He'd seen that look before, on the faces of junior officers who were trying to prove themselves, who couldn't afford to have their first major exercise fail due to equipment problems. "What's the malfunction?" he asked, already reaching for his diagnostic equipment. "Dead air on all tactical frequencies. The technician said it might be the main transceiver, but they're tied up with another unit until 1600. Jake nodded, understanding the situation immediately. Their platoon leader's first field exercise was a crucial test, both for the soldiers and their commanding officer. Equipment failure wasn't just an inconvenience, it was potentially career-damaging. "I'll take a look," Jake said simply, gathering his tools. As they walked toward the vehicle bay where the communication equipment was mounted, Lieutenant Chen glanced at him sideways. "You're not what I expected from a contractor. Most of the civilian techs I've worked with need 3 people and a manual to change a frequency." Jake didn't respond, but he'd heard variations of this observation before. His efficiency often surprised people who expected civilian contractors to work at a more leisurely pace than military personnel. What they didn't know was that old habits died hard, especially when those habits had been forged under fire. The communications array sat in the back of a modified Humvee, its antenna array folded down for maintenance. Jake approached the equipment with the same methodical precision he'd shown thousands of times before, though his hands moved with a speed that spoke of extensive experience. Lieutenant Chen watched as Jake's fingers danced over the control panels, running diagnostics that would typically take a technician 30 minutes to complete. Within 5 minutes, Jake had isolated the problem. "For your issue isn't the transceiver," he said, pointing to a series of connections behind the main unit. "Water got into the antenna coupling during last week's storm. Corrosion built up and created signal interference. The automatic diagnostic system interpreted it as a transceiver failure. "Can you fix it in time?" Chen asked, checking her watch. 2.5 hours until the exercise began. Jake was already pulling corroded connectors apart, his movements economical and sure. "Give me 45 minutes. As Jake worked, Chen found herself studying the contractor more closely. There was something about his bearing, the way he approached the equipment, that reminded her of the senior NCOs she'd trained under. He moved with a confidence that came from experience, not just technical knowledge. "How long have you been working communications?" she asked, trying to make conversation while he worked. "Long time," Jake replied without looking up, using a wire brush to clean corrosion from connector pins. "Military background?" Jake's hands paused for just a fraction of a second before continuing. "Some." Chen recognized the deflection. She'd learned to read soldiers, and apparently former soldiers, well enough to know when someone didn't want to discuss their service record. But her curiosity was piqued. The way Jake handled the equipment, the speed of his diagnosis, the casual competence he displayed, this wasn't just some military experience. 20 minutes later, Jake was reassembling the antenna coupling with new connectors he'd pulled from his seemingly bottomless toolbox. His movements were so fluid that Chen found herself mesmerized by the process. "Test it now," Jake said, stepping back from the equipment. Chen keyed the handset. "Bravo 6. Actual to base. Comms check, over." The response came back immediately, crystal clear. "Base to Bravo 6 actual, copy 5x5, over." For the first time that morning, Chen smiled genuinely. "Outstanding. What do I owe you for the priority service?" Jake was already packing his tools. "Nothing, just doing my job." "At least let me buy you lunch, there's got to be something." "Not necessary, Lieutenant." Jake's tone was polite, but final. He shouldered his toolbox and headed toward his truck. Chen watched him go, more intrigued than ever. As Jake's pickup disappeared around the corner of the motor pool, she found herself wondering what kind of some military experience produced that level of expertise and humility. What she didn't know was that Jake Morrison had just completed in 37 minutes what would have taken a standard repair team half a day. More importantly, she didn't know that the casual competence she'd witnessed was the product of 3 tours in Afghanistan, where communication failures didn't just threaten exercises, they threatened lives. Back in his truck, Jake gripped the steering wheel and took a deep breath. He'd managed to help without drawing too much attention, answered Chen's questions without revealing anything significant, just another day of staying invisible. But as he drove back toward the communications building to finish his routine maintenance, Jake couldn't shake the memory of the young lieutenant's expression when the radio crackled to life. It reminded him of why he'd chosen this work, why helping from the shadows still mattered, even when nobody knew who was doing the helping. 2 hours later, Jake was back at his workbench when the first emergency call came through the base communications system. He recognized Lieutenant Chen's voice immediately, though the calm professionalism couldn't quite mask an underlying tension. "Base, this is Bravo 6 actual. We have a medical emergency at grid reference 347892. Request immediate medevac support, over." Jake's hands stilled on the radio chassis he'd been repairing. Training exercises occasionally produced real injuries, twisted ankles, heat exhaustion, the occasional broken bone from enthusiastic soldiers pushing too hard. But something in Chen's voice suggested this was more serious. The response from base operations crackled through. "Bravo 6 actual. Medevac is 23 minutes out due to air traffic. Can you provide patient status, over?" Base. "Patient is a 20-year-old male, possible cardiac event. He's conscious but experiencing chest pain and difficulty breathing. We need that bird here now, over." Jake found himself moving toward the main communications console without conscious thought. 23 minutes was an eternity when someone was having a heart attack. At 20 years old, it was probably not cardiac, heat stroke maybe, or an undiagnosed condition triggered by physical stress. Either way, the kid needed help fast. Specialist Rodriguez noticed Jake's sudden interest in the emergency frequency. "Something wrong, Mr. Morrison?" "Maybe," Jake murmured, his mind already working through possibilities. He knew the training area Chen's platoon was using, a remote section of Fort Bragg's extensive ranges, accessible only by rough dirt roads. Even if an ambulance could navigate the terrain, it would take longer than a helicopter. The radio crackled again. All stations, be advised that medevac is now delayed due to mechanical issues. Ground ambulance dispatched. ETA 47 minutes to grid reference 347892. Jake's jaw tightened. 47 minutes could be the difference between life and death. He keyed into the base frequency, something he'd never done in 3 years of civilian work. Base, this is communications maintenance. I have an alternate solution for the medical emergency, over. There was a pause before base operations responded. Communications maintenance, state your alternate solution, over. Jake took a deep breath, knowing he was about to blow his careful anonymity. Base, there's a civilian medevac helicopter at Womack Army Medical Center, approximately 8 minutes from the emergency location. I can establish direct communications and coordinate emergency authorization, over. Communications maintenance. That's not standard protocol. We don't have authority to... Jake cut them off, his voice taking on an edge that made Specialist Rodriguez straighten up. Base, with respect, I'm looking at a 20-year-old soldier who might not have 47 minutes. Give me 2 minutes to make this happen, over. Before waiting for a response, Jake switched to a different frequency and began working his way through channels he hadn't used in years. His fingers moved across the radio controls with practiced efficiency, navigating military and civilian emergency frequencies with the ease of someone who'd done this under much worse conditions. Within 90 seconds, Jake had civilian emergency services on the line, had explained the situation, and was coordinating with the pilot of a medical helicopter that had just finished a routine transport. The pilot agreed to the emergency pickup, pending official authorization. Jake switched back to the base frequency. Base, this is communications maintenance. Civilian medevac is airborne and will be on station in 6 minutes. I need someone with authority to provide emergency authorization for military assistance, over. This time a different voice responded, older, with the unmistakable authority of senior rank. Communications maintenance. This is Colonel Patterson. Explain how a contractor has civilian medevac resources, over. Jake hesitated for just a moment. Once he answered, there would be questions, attention, scrutiny, everything he'd spent 3 years avoiding. But in the background, he could hear Lieutenant Chen's voice on the tactical frequency, talking to her soldier, keeping him calm while they waited for help that might come too late. Colonel, I have contacts in civilian emergency services. The helicopter is 2 minutes out from the emergency location. All we need is authorization for them to land on military property and transport the soldier to Womack, over. Authorization granted, Colonel Patterson replied immediately. Communications maintenance. Report to my office at 1700 hours, over. Jake closed his eyes briefly. There it was, the summons he'd been dreading for 3 years. But as he heard the civilian helicopter pilot confirm visual contact with Chen's ground team, he knew he'd made the right choice. The civilian medevac helicopter was on the ground for exactly 4 minutes. Jake listened as the medical team stabilized the soldier, Private Jackson, he learned from the radio chatter, and confirmed that it was indeed heat stroke, complicated by an undiagnosed heart murmur. Serious but treatable with immediate medical attention. By 15:30, Private Jackson was in the ICU at Womack Army Medical Center, stable and conscious. Lieutenant Chen's voice over the radio carried obvious relief as she reported the successful medevac to base operations. Jake spent the remaining hours of his shift trying to focus on routine maintenance, but his mind kept drifting to the meeting with Colonel Patterson. He'd worked so hard to remain invisible, and now he'd blown his cover to save one soldier. Part of him wondered if it had been worth it. At exactly 1700 hours, Jake knocked on Colonel Patterson's office door. The colonel was a lean man in his mid-50s, with grey hair and the kind of steady gaze that suggested he'd seen his share of difficult situations. Mr. Morrison, please sit, Patterson said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. I'll get straight to the point. What you did today was impressive, but it raises some questions about your background that I think we need to address. Jake nodded, having expected this conversation. Yes, sir. Your employment file says you have some military experience, but what I witnessed today suggests considerably more than some. The way you navigated emergency frequencies, your knowledge of medevac protocols, your ability to coordinate with civilian emergency services, that's not contractor-level expertise. Patterson opened a folder on his desk. I've been making some calls since this afternoon. Your security clearance paperwork shows prior military service, but the details are mostly redacted. What I can see suggests you held a much higher clearance than would be typical for a communications technician. Jake remained silent, unsure how much to reveal. I'm not trying to pry into classified operations, Morrison. But I have young officers and NCOs on this base who could benefit from your experience. What happened today with Lieutenant Chen's platoon? That kind of quick thinking and expertise doesn't come from a manual. Colonel, I took this contractor job because I wanted to stay in the background, help where I could without getting involved, Patterson finished. I understand that. I've known plenty of veterans who preferred to serve quietly after their active duty ended, but sometimes circumstances don't allow us to stay in the background. Patterson leaned forward. Private Jackson is alive because you were willing to step forward today. Lieutenant Chen's first field exercise didn't turn into a disaster because you knew how to solve a problem that would have stumped most people. That matters, Morrison. It matters a lot. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair. This was exactly the kind of attention he'd been avoiding. I'm not asking you to change your job or take on new responsibilities, Patterson continued. But I am asking you to consider that your experience has value beyond fixing radio equipment. Lieutenant Chen, for instance, is a good officer with solid potential, but she's still learning. Having someone with your background available as an informal resource could make a real difference. Sir, with respect, I'm not sure I'm the right person for mentoring young officers. Patterson smiled slightly. Morrison, anyone who can coordinate a civilian medevac helicopter, using emergency frequencies while simultaneously maintaining communication security protocols, is exactly the right person. The question is whether you're willing to admit it. As Jake left Colonel Patterson's office 20 minutes later, he found himself thinking about Lieutenant Chen's expression when the radio had crackled to life that morning, and again when the helicopter lifted off with Private Jackson safely aboard. There was something about her determination, her genuine concern for her soldiers, that reminded him why he'd chosen to serve in the first place. Maybe, Jake thought as he walked toward his truck, staying completely invisible wasn't as important as he'd convinced himself it was. Maybe there was a middle ground between hiding from his past and being consumed by it. What he didn't know was that Lieutenant Chen was already asking questions about the contractor who'd somehow managed to save her soldier's life. And unlike Colonel Patterson, she wasn't planning to wait for Jake to volunteer information about his background. Lieutenant Sarah Chen had always been thorough, a trait that had served her well through West Point and her first year as a commissioned officer. But as she sat in her quarters that evening, researching Jake Morrison on her laptop, thoroughness was turning into obsession. The official databases told her almost nothing. Jake Morrison, age 45, hired as a communications contractor 3 years ago. Prior military service confirmed, but details classified above her clearance level. Security background check completed with no flags. It was the kind of sanitized file that usually meant someone had stories they weren't allowed to tell. Chen leaned back in her desk chair, frustrated. The man who had casually coordinated a civilian medevac helicopter while maintaining perfect communication security wasn't just some military experience. That kind of expertise came from years of high-level operations. Her phone buzzed with a text from her platoon sergeant, Staff Sergeant Williams. Lieutenant, Private Jackson is stable. Docs say he'll make a full recovery. Wants to thank you for getting him help so fast. Chen smiled, but the message only reinforced her curiosity about Morrison. She hadn't gotten Jackson help fast. Morrison had. All she'd done was key a radio and follow his instructions. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Come in. Sergeant First Class Martinez, one of the senior NCOs in the company, stepped inside. At 34, Martinez had been in the Army for 14 years and had developed the kind of institutional knowledge that made him invaluable to young officers. Evening, Lieutenant. Heard about the excitement during your FTX today. News travels fast, Chen replied, closing her laptop. Private Jackson's going to be fine if that's what you're asking. That's good to hear, but actually, I wanted to talk to you about something else. Word is that civilian contractor Morrison was the one who set up the medevac. Chen nodded. He did. Coordinated the whole thing like he'd been doing emergency management for decades. Why? Martinez sat down in the chair across from her desk, his expression thoughtful. I've been here at Bragg for 6 years, and I've seen Morrison around plenty. Always keeps to himself, does his work, doesn't interact much with active duty personnel. But there's something about him that's always seemed familiar. Familiar how? The way he moves, the way he observes everything around him. You know how you can usually spot former infantry, even when they're in civilian clothes? Morrison has that bearing, but more than that. He's got the awareness of someone who's been in serious situations. Chen reopened her laptop. I've been trying to research his background, but his file is mostly classified. Martinez leaned forward. Lieutenant, can I give you some advice? If Morrison's file is classified, there's usually a good reason. Men like that sometimes take contractor jobs because they want to serve without the attention that comes with wearing a uniform. But don't you think we should know who we're working with, especially if he's going to be involved in emergency situations? I think, Martinez said carefully, that what happened today proves we can trust him. Sometimes that's more important than knowing someone's complete service record. After Martinez left, Chen found herself staring at her laptop screen again. The rational part of her mind agreed with the sergeant's advice. Morrison had proven himself when it mattered, but the officer in her, the part trained to gather intelligence and understand her operational environment, couldn't let it go. She picked up her phone and dialed her mentor from West Point, now Lieutenant Colonel Davis, stationed at the Pentagon. Sarah, how's the new platoon leader treating you? It's going well, Colonel, but I need a favor. I'm trying to get some background information on someone, and his file is classified above my level. There was a pause. Sarah, you know I can't help you access classified personnel files without proper justification. It's not for curiosity, Colonel. This person was involved in an emergency situation today, and I need to understand his capabilities for future operations. Chen explained the day's events, emphasizing Morrison's expertise and the questions it raised about his background. Give me his full name and service dates if you have them, Davis said finally. I can't share classified information, but I might be able to give you some general context. 20 minutes later, Davis called back. Her voice was different, more serious, more careful. Sarah, I can't tell you specifics, but I can tell you that Jake Morrison is someone you should respect. His service record includes multiple deployments in communications and intelligence roles. The classification level on his file suggests he was involved in operations that were significant. How significant? The kind that don't make it into newspapers, the kind that save lives and complete missions that most people never know happened. If Morrison is working as a contractor at Bragg, it's because he chose to continue serving in a different capacity. After the call ended, Chen sat in the darkness of her quarters, processing this new information. Morrison wasn't just a competent contractor. He was someone with a distinguished, if hidden, service record who had chosen to work in the shadows. The question was, why? The next morning, Jake arrived at work to find Lieutenant Chen waiting by his truck. She was in her PT uniform, having apparently finished her morning run, and decided to intercept him before he could disappear into the communications building. Mr. Morrison, could I have a word? Jake sighed internally. He'd hoped yesterday's incident would blow over quickly, but Chen's presence suggested otherwise. Sure, Lieutenant. What can I do for you? I wanted to thank you properly for what you did yesterday. Private Jackson's parents called me last night. They wanted to express their gratitude to everyone involved in saving their son's life. Jake shifted his toolbox to his other hand, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Just did what anyone would have done. No, Chen said firmly. What you did was extraordinary. Most people wouldn't have known how to coordinate civilian emergency services with military operations. Most people wouldn't have had the contacts or the expertise to make it happen in under 2 minutes. She paused, studying his face. I've been wondering how a communications contractor develops that kind of capability. There it was, the question Jake had been dreading. He could see in Chen's eyes that she wasn't going to be satisfied with vague answers. Lieutenant, I appreciate your gratitude, but I did some research, Chen interrupted. Not into classified material, she added quickly, seeing Jake's expression tighten. But I know enough to understand that you're not just any contractor. You're someone with significant military experience who's chosen to continue serving in a different way. Jake was quiet for a long moment, weighing his options. He could continue deflecting, transfer to a different base or find work somewhere else entirely, but looking at Chen, seeing her genuine respect and curiosity rather than idle gossip, he found himself reconsidering his usual approach. Why does it matter, Lieutenant? Because I have 32 soldiers under my command, and most of them are younger than 25. They look to me for leadership, but I'm still learning myself. Yesterday, when Private Jackson went down, I froze for about 10 seconds before training kicked in. Those 10 seconds could have cost him his life if you hadn't been monitoring the emergency frequency. Chen stepped closer, her voice earnest. I'm not asking you to take on official responsibilities or change your job, But if you're willing to share some of that experience, even informally, it could make a real difference for these young soldiers. Jake looked past her toward the communications building, where Specialist Rodriguez was probably already wondering where he was. 3 years of carefully maintained anonymity, and now a determined young officer was asking him to step back into a world he'd deliberately left behind. "I took this contractor job for a reason, Lieutenant. There are aspects of my service that I prefer not to discuss. I understand that. But there are also aspects of your service that could help save lives, not just in emergencies like yesterday, but in the day-to-day decisions that young leaders have to make." Jake hefted his toolbox again, a gesture that usually signaled the end of conversations he didn't want to continue. But something in Chen's expression, the combination of determination and vulnerability, reminded him of officers he'd worked with in Afghanistan. Good officers who'd been willing to listen, to learn, to put their soldiers' welfare above their own pride. "What exactly are you asking for?" "Nothing formal. Maybe occasionally answer questions when junior officers or NCOs are dealing with communications challenges. Share some practical wisdom when someone's facing a situation they haven't encountered before. Be available as a resource for people who could benefit from your experience." Jake considered this. It wasn't quite the invisible service he'd preferred, but it wasn't the full exposure he'd been avoiding either. A middle ground that might allow him to help without becoming the center of attention. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Chen smiled, the first genuine smile Jake had seen from her. "That's all I'm asking, think about it." As she jogged away toward the company area, Jake found himself watching her go. There was something about Lieutenant Chen that reminded him why he'd chosen to serve in the first place, why he'd stayed in dangerous places, doing difficult work for years. She genuinely cared about her soldiers, was willing to admit what she didn't know, and was determined to be better. Maybe, Jake thought as he finally headed toward the communications building, helping people like her wasn't such a bad way to continue serving. What he didn't know was that his decision to consider Chen's request would soon be tested in ways that would force him to confront not just his past, but the question of what kind of future he wanted to build from it. 3 days later, Jake was deep in the wiring harness of a tactical radio when Specialist Rodriguez burst through the communications building door, his face flushed with exertion and concern. "Mr. Morrison, we've got a problem. Lieutenant Chen's platoon is out on a night navigation exercise, and they've lost contact with base. Last transmission was 30 minutes ago." Jake looked up from his work, immediately alert. Night navigation exercises were routine, but communication blackouts weren't. What was their last reported position? "Grid 423556, moving southeast toward Checkpoint Bravo. They were supposed to report every 15 minutes, but we've had nothing since 21:15. Jake glanced at the wall clock, 21:47. In the field, 30 minutes of radio silence could mean anything from equipment failure to serious trouble. His mind automatically began running through possibilities: terrain interference, equipment malfunction, or worse. Who's handling the situation? "Captain Morrison is in a meeting with the battalion commander. Operations wants to wait another 30 minutes before launching search protocols." Jake's jaw tightened. Standard procedure called for investigation after 1 hour of missed contact, but in his experience, waiting that long could turn a manageable situation into a crisis. He moved toward the main communications console. What frequency were they using? Rodriguez provided the tactical frequency, and Jake began systematically checking for signal interference, atmospheric conditions, and equipment status. Within 5 minutes, he determined that all base equipment was functioning normally. Atmospheric conditions were clear, and there were no reported communication outages in that sector of the training area, which meant the problem was with Chen's unit. Jake made a decision that would have surprised him 3 days earlier. "Rodriguez, I'm going to try to establish contact using alternate frequencies. Monitor base operations and let me know if anything changes." For the next 20 minutes, Jake worked through every communication protocol he knew, attempting to reach Chen's platoon through primary and backup frequencies, emergency channels, and even civilian radio bands that military units sometimes used in extremis. Nothing. At 22:15, exactly 1 hour after the last transmission, Captain Morrison returned from his meeting and immediately began coordinating a search and rescue operation. Jake watched from his workstation as the command post transformed into a hub of activity. Duty officers calling units, maps being spread across tables, helicopter crews being alerted. "Mr. Morrison," Captain Morrison called out, having noticed Jake's presence at the main console. "Rodriguez says you've been trying to establish communication with the missing unit." "Yes, sir." "No response on any frequency. Equipment appears to be completely down." Captain Morrison studied the map where staff officers had marked Chen's last known position. "It's rough terrain out there, lots of draws and ridge lines that could interfere with radio signals, but Lieutenant Chen is competent. If they were just dealing with equipment failure, she'd have found a way to signal by now." Jake found himself moving closer to the map, his eyes automatically analyzing the terrain features and likely routes of movement. After a moment, he pointed to a series of contour lines southeast of Chen's last reported position. "Captain, if they were moving toward Checkpoint Bravo and encountered problems, they'd most likely be somewhere in this area," Jake said, indicating a narrow valley between two ridgelines. "It's a natural corridor, but it's also a communication dead zone. Radio waves can't penetrate that terrain effectively." "You know this area?" Jake paused, realizing he was revealing more tactical knowledge than a simple contractor should possess. But, with 32 soldiers potentially in danger, his usual caution seemed less important. "I've studied the topographical maps. That valley creates a natural Faraday cage effect. Any unit moving through there would lose communication contact until they reached higher ground." Captain Morrison examined the area Jake had indicated. "If they're in there, how do we establish contact?" Jake's mind was already working through the technical challenges. In Afghanistan, he'd dealt with similar communication problems dozens of times. The solution required thinking beyond standard procedures. "We need to get a relay station positioned on the high ground here," Jake said, pointing to a ridgeline overlooking the valley. "A helicopter could drop a portable repeater that would allow communication into and out of that dead zone." "Do we have portable repeaters available?" Jake nodded toward a storage area in the communications building. "I've been maintaining 3 of them for the past 6 months. They're ready to deploy." Captain Morrison looked at Jake with new interest. "Morrison, how does a contractor know detailed tactics for establishing communication relays in dead zones?" It was the question Jake had been dreading, but as he looked around the command post, at the concerned faces of officers and NCOs who were genuinely worried about their soldiers, he realized he couldn't continue hiding behind vague answers. "Because I've done it before, sir. Multiple times, in places where the stakes were higher than a training exercise." The command post fell silent. Every officer and NCO within earshot had stopped what they were doing to listen to Jake's admission. Captain Morrison stared at him for a long moment, clearly reassessing everything he thought he knew about the quiet contractor. "Morrison, I need to know exactly what kind of experience we're talking about." Jake took a deep breath, knowing that his 3 years of anonymity were about to end permanently. But with Chen's platoon potentially in danger, his personal comfort seemed insignificant. 12 years active duty, sir. 3 tours in Afghanistan as a communications specialist with special operations units. I've established emergency communication relays in hostile territory under combat conditions." The silence stretched longer. Finally, Captain Morrison nodded slowly. "Then I think we need your expertise tonight. Can you set up this relay system?" "Yes, sir. But I'll need helicopter support and someone who knows how to operate the equipment once it's in place." "You'll have whatever you need. How long to get it operational?" Jake was already moving toward the equipment storage area. 20 minutes to prep the gear, another 20 for the helicopter to reach the drop zone and establish the relay. We could have communication restored within 45 minutes. As Jake began pulling components for the portable repeater system, Specialist Rodriguez watched in amazement. The quiet contractor who had spent 3 years fixing routine equipment problems was suddenly orchestrating a complex communication rescue operation with the confidence of someone who'd done it many times before. "Mr. Morrison," Rodriguez said quietly, "why didn't you ever tell anyone about your background?" Jake paused in his equipment check, considering how to answer. "Because some experiences are easier to carry when you don't have to explain them to everyone you meet." Within 15 minutes, Jake had assembled a portable communication relay system that could boost and redirect radio signals across the terrain that was blocking contact with Chen's platoon. The equipment was compact but sophisticated, the kind of gear that special operations units used when standard communication methods failed. As the helicopter crew prepared for the relay deployment mission, Colonel Patterson arrived at the command post. He took one look at Jake, coordinating with the pilot, and approached Captain Morrison. I see Mr. Morrison is involved in the search operation. Sir, Morrison has experience with communication relay systems. He's setting up equipment to establish contact with the missing unit. Patterson watched Jake explain signal coverage patterns to the helicopter crew, using terminology and tactical concepts that clearly went far beyond basic contractor knowledge. Captain, after we recover Lieutenant Chen's platoon safely, I think it's time we had a more complete understanding of Mr. Morrison's qualifications. 28 minutes later, the helicopter reported successful deployment of the relay station. Jake keyed the radio with a frequency he calculated would now reach into the valley where Chen's unit was likely located. Bravo 6 Actual. This is base operations. Do you copy? Over. Static filled the command post for several seconds. Then, clear as if she were in the next room, Lieutenant Chen's voice came through the speakers. Base operations, this is Bravo 6 Actual. We copy 5 by 5. We have 2 soldiers with injuries from a vehicle rollover and have been unable to establish communication for the past hour and 20 minutes. Request immediate medical evacuation. Over. The relief in the command post was palpable. Within minutes, medevac helicopters were airborne, and Chen's platoon was providing detailed information about their location and the condition of the injured soldiers. As Jake began shutting down the communication equipment he'd used to coordinate the rescue, Colonel Patterson approached him. Morrison, I think it's time we had that conversation about your background that I mentioned the other day. Jake nodded, unsurprised. Yes, sir. I figured this would happen eventually. The question is, why has someone with your capabilities been content to work in the shadows for 3 years? Jake looked around the command post, where officers and NCOs were efficiently managing the final stages of the rescue operation. These people cared about their soldiers, worked together effectively, and didn't hesitate to call for help when they needed it. They reminded him of the best units he'd served with during his active duty years. Because I wasn't sure I was ready to be part of something like this again, sir. But watching what happened tonight, seeing how everyone came together to help Lieutenant Chen's soldiers, maybe I was wrong about staying invisible. As the first medevac helicopter reported successful pickup of the injured soldiers, Jake realized that his carefully constructed anonymity was over. The question now was what he would build to replace it. The next morning, Jake arrived at work to find his usual parking space occupied by 3 military vehicles and a small crowd of soldiers gathered near the communications building. Word of the previous night's rescue operation had spread quickly through Fort Bragg, and Jake's role in establishing the communication relay was now common knowledge. As he approached the building, conversations stopped, and soldiers turned to look at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright respect. Jake felt the familiar knot of anxiety in his stomach. This was exactly the kind of attention he'd spent 3 years avoiding. Mr. Morrison! Specialist Rodriguez emerged from the crowd, his face lit up with excitement. There's been talk all morning about what you did last night. Some of the guys are saying you used to be special ops. Jake shouldered his toolbox and headed for the building entrance, hoping to escape the scrutiny. I just helped with some radio equipment, Rodriguez. Nothing special. But as Jake entered the building, he found Colonel Patterson waiting for him, along with Lieutenant Chen and a man Jake didn't recognize, a tall, lean soldier with the bearing of senior enlisted leadership. Morrison, this is Command Sergeant Major Thompson, Patterson said. He's the senior NCO for the 82nd Airborne Division, and he wanted to meet you personally. Thompson stepped forward and extended his hand. Mr. Morrison, I wanted to thank you for what you did last night. Those were my soldiers in that valley, and your actions probably saved lives. Jake shook the offered hand, uncomfortable with the formal gratitude. I just did what needed to be done, Sergeant Major. That's exactly what I'm talking about, Thompson replied. In my 26 years in the Army, I've learned to recognize soldiers who just do what needs to be done, regardless of recognition or personal cost. That's leadership, whether you wear a uniform or not. Colonel Patterson gestured toward his office. Morrison, we need to discuss your situation. All of us. Once they were seated in Patterson's office, the colonel opened the same folder Jake had seen several days earlier. But now there were additional documents, official-looking papers that hadn't been there before. Morrison, I took the liberty of having your complete service record reviewed by someone with appropriate clearance. What I learned explains a great deal about your capabilities and your preference for anonymity. Jake tensed, knowing that his carefully guarded past was about to be laid bare. Patterson continued. 3 tours in Afghanistan with the 5th Special Forces Group, multiple commendations for actions under fire, a Silver Star for valor during a communication relay operation that enabled the rescue of a trapped patrol, and a medical retirement following an IED incident that injured several members of your unit. The room fell silent. Jake stared at his hands, remembering the day that had ended his military career, the explosion that had killed 2 of his teammates and left him with physical injuries that healed and psychological wounds that hadn't. Lieutenant Chen spoke first. "Mr. Morrison, I had no idea. When I asked you to consider mentoring junior officers, I didn't realize what you'd been through." Jake finally looked up, meeting her eyes. "That's why I took this contractor job, Lieutenant. I wanted to serve without having to carry the weight of those memories every day. Working on radio equipment in a peaceful environment seemed like a good way to contribute without complications." Command Sergeant Major Thompson leaned forward. "Morrison, what you've been doing here for 3 years, maintaining critical communication equipment, helping when emergencies arise, staying ready to serve even when no one knew your qualifications, that's honorable service. There's no shame in choosing a quieter way to contribute." "But," Colonel Patterson added, "what happened last night demonstrates that your experience has value beyond routine maintenance. The question is whether you're willing to take on a more visible role." Jake was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. For 3 years he'd convinced himself that anonymity was the only way he could continue serving without being consumed by memories of what he'd lost in Afghanistan. But watching the relief on Chen's face when her soldiers were rescued, seeing the gratitude of the command staff, feeling useful in a way he hadn't experienced since his medical retirement, it made him reconsider what he'd been avoiding. "What kind of role are you talking about, sir?" Patterson smiled. "Nothing that would require you to change your contractor status or take on official military duties, but there are opportunities here at Bragg for someone with your background to make a real difference. Training junior officers in advanced communication techniques, serving as a technical advisor for complex operations, being available as a resource when situations arise that require your level of expertise." Lieutenant Chen added, "and maybe occasionally preventing young platoon leaders from making mistakes that could cost soldiers' lives." Jake looked around the room at 3 people who represented different aspects of military service: the senior officer balancing mission requirements with personnel welfare, the experienced NCO who understood the value of practical leadership, and the junior officer who was still learning but genuinely cared about her soldiers. They weren't asking him to forget his past or pretend his injuries hadn't happened. They were asking him to use his experience to help others, to serve in a way that honored what he'd learned without requiring him to return to the circumstances that had damaged him. "I need some time to think about this," Jake said finally. "Of course," Patterson replied. "Take whatever time you need. But Morrison, I want you to know that whatever you decide, you have the respect and support of everyone in this room." That evening, Jake sat on the porch of his small house outside Fayetteville, a beer growing warm in his hand, as he watched the sunset paint the North Carolina sky in shades of orange and purple. For 3 years, this quiet routine had been enough. Work during the day, solitude in the evening, no complications or expectations beyond fixing radio equipment and staying invisible. But the events of the past week had shattered that carefully constructed simplicity. Private Jackson's medical emergency, Lieutenant Chen's request for mentorship, the communication relay operation that had saved her platoon, each incident had pulled him further away from the anonymity he'd thought he wanted. His phone buzzed with a text message from his sister in Colorado. Saw the news article about a communication specialist helping with a rescue at Fort Bragg. That wouldn't happen to be my little brother, would it? Jake smiled despite himself. Even 1,000 miles away, Sarah had always been able to see through his attempts to avoid attention. He typed back, "Maybe. Long story." Her response came immediately. "Jake, I've been worried about you for 3 years. You took that job to hide from life, not to live it. Maybe it's time to stop hiding." As if summoned by his thoughts about family, another text arrived, this one from Lieutenant Chen. "Mr. Morrison, I wanted you to know that both injured soldiers from last night are doing well. Private Martinez will be back to full duty in 2 weeks. I know you don't like recognition, but what you did mattered. Thank you." Jake set his phone aside and thought about the young lieutenant who reminded him why he'd chosen military service in the first place. Chen cared about her soldiers the way the best officers he'd known had cared. Personally, completely, without reservation. She was willing to learn, to ask for help, to put her soldiers' welfare above her own pride. She was the kind of leader worth supporting. Jake's mind drifted to Command Sergeant Major Thompson, whose 26 years of service had taught him to recognize value in unexpected places. Thompson understood that leadership came in many forms, that contributing to the mission was more important than wearing the right uniform or holding the right rank. And Colonel Patterson, who had seen past Jake's preference for anonymity, to recognize capabilities that could benefit others. Patterson wasn't asking Jake to become something he wasn't, just to stop hiding what he was. As the last light faded from the sky, Jake made his decision. The next morning he arrived at Fort Bragg 30 minutes early and went directly to Colonel Patterson's office. Patterson was reviewing morning reports when Jake knocked on his door. "Morrison, come in. Have you had time to consider our conversation?" "Yes, sir. I'd like to accept your offer with some conditions." Patterson leaned back in his chair, interested. "What conditions?" "I want to remain a contractor. I'm not ready to put on a uniform again, and I may never be. But I'm willing to take on additional responsibilities as long as they're consistent with my current status. That's acceptable." "What else?" "I want to work primarily with junior officers and NCOs, people who are still learning, who can benefit from practical experience. I'm not interested in high-level planning or strategic operations. I want to help at the level where it directly impacts soldiers." Patterson nodded. "Also acceptable. In fact, that's exactly where I think your experience would be most valuable." Jake took a deep breath before stating his final condition. "And I want Lieutenant Chen to be my primary point of contact for any mentoring activities. She understands what I can offer, and she knows how to ask for help without making it about rank or protocol." Patterson smiled. "I think Lieutenant Chen would be honored by that arrangement." As Jake left Patterson's office, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, a sense of purpose that went beyond simply maintaining equipment and staying invisible. He was still the same man who had been injured in Afghanistan, still carried the same memories of friends he'd lost. But maybe, as his sister had suggested, it was time to stop hiding from life and start living it again. That afternoon, Jake found Lieutenant Chen in the company area, reviewing training schedules with her platoon sergeant. She looked up as he approached, surprise evident on her face. "Mr. Morrison, is everything all right?" "Lieutenant, I've been thinking about our conversation the other day, about sharing experience and helping young leaders. If the offer's still open, I'd like to take you up on it." Chen's face lit up with a smile that reminded Jake why he'd made the right decision. "Mr. Morrison, the offer will always be open. When do we start?" Jake looked around at the soldiers going about their daily duties, young men and women who had volunteered to serve their country, who depended on their leaders to prepare them for whatever challenges they might face. It wasn't Afghanistan, wasn't the high-stakes environment he'd left behind, but it was still service. It was still meaningful. "How about now?" he said. As they walked toward the communications building to discuss training opportunities for Chen's soldiers, Jake realized that his 3-year retreat into anonymity was over. He couldn't change what had happened in Afghanistan, couldn't bring back the teammates he'd lost, couldn't erase the memories that still haunted his sleep. But he could help ensure that the next generation of soldiers was better prepared, better led, and better supported than his unit had been on that terrible day when his military career ended. He could serve quietly but meaningfully, contributing his experience without seeking recognition, helping others without having to relive his own trauma. It wasn't the service he'd originally planned, but it was the service that was needed now. And for the first time in 3 years, that felt like enough. 3 weeks later, when Private Jackson returned to duty and personally thanked Jake for saving his life, Jake finally understood what Colonel Patterson had meant about the value of stepping forward. Some contributions were too important to keep hidden, even when hiding felt safer. Jake Morrison was no longer invisible, but perhaps he realized that was exactly how it should be.